The AI hype narrative is so far ahead of reality that there is bound to be a reckoning. Let's talk about it. Welcome to Dave is Not AI. I'm Dave, an AI SME and an AI skeptic, looking at AI with a balanced perspective. Let's get started. So the reason I'm making this video is if you look at the current state of the industry and you look at the hype narrative, and that's basically everything the press is talking about, the CEOs of these, multi-trillion-dollar market cap, AI companies are talking about, is way far out away from reality. And it's probably worse than I've seen ever in my career. And I've gone through cloud computing, rise of the PC, client server, rise of the web, all that kind of stuff. But never have I seen a hype narrative that is so far out ahead of what the technology can actually do and what's occurring in the industry right now, that it's interesting. And so it's interesting to me, and I figured we'd go through it. So first and foremost, AI coding tools. They can speed you up, but they still need careful human review because they can generate looks right code that breaks, misses edge cases, or causes security problems. And there's lots of videos on this out here, so I'm not going to dwell on it. And so again, 2 years ago, we thought that developers were going to be replaced by AI. And of course, that's what all of the, the AI CEOs were saying. Obviously, Sam Altman, a bunch of those folks. That never happened, and the companies that tried to replace developers with AI ended up just racking up lots of technical debt that they had to go back and fix. The reality is AI can speed development, and in many cases it can be a tool that aids development, but it's not something that can replace developers. You still need somebody to design the system, look at what's going on behind the scenes, how you're coding it, the structure. All those sorts of things are very important. If you just let an AI system generate the code for you, it's going to be a huge unmaintainable mess that's going to be truly under-optimized, and it's going to end up costing you more money than if you hired an engineer. And I think many companies have touched the stove and they figured that out, and they're reeling from it right now. So also chatbots can confidently make things up, so you can't treat their answers like facts without checking. And this is a hallucination thing. And this is something that is not necessarily going to get fixed anytime soon. In fact, the way that these LLM models are structured around generative AI, things like that, hallucinations are really going to be part of the technology. It's going to be a limitation of how they do it. And what's frustrating is hallucinating can look true. In other words, it can get very close to what the truth is and the reality it can be. So in many times people don't spot them. And ultimately later when someone checks, normally it's a detail thing, references, things like that. And it's found out, you end up looking dumb. And consulting organizations have made these huge mistakes where they, went ahead and let, ChatGPT or whatever, some LLM, write reports for them. The reports look fairly credible, but when you look at the details and the facts that they're providing in the report, it turns out to be junk. In other words, it's not true. And they have to go back and check them and correct them, or it's an embarrassing, instance from you have to give back the money that you charge them, probably overcharge them to create the report. So a limitation of AI in limitation of LLM specifically is that. So you can't really rely on the information because the information may or may not be credible based on how you structured the prompt, based on what you're asking for, the kind of data you're looking for. So it could be a conflict in training. It could be, some sort of a thing where it doesn't know or understand the answer to the question that you're asking, but it's going to give you an answer anyway. And LLMs have a tendency to do that. They almost try to please us. So they're almost always going to give us an answer. They're never going to say we don't know, even if they have to make it up. And of course, why don't they just create the LLMs that, don't make up answers? Love to do that. And actually there's ways and some prompt tricks you can use to reduce, but not eliminate the number of hallucinations that you have, but still trusting much of this information, responses that come back out of these LLM systems has to be vetted. You have to understand where it came from, what it means, and see if it's correct or not, or else you're going to end up making, multi-million-dollar mistakes as we're seeing being made out there right now. So next, AI everywhere runs into physical limits because all this AI is going to need a data center to run, chips, and a lot of electricity to operate at scale. So the scalability of this is misunderstood. And so in other words, we don't have unlimited scalability. We only have a certain amount of power that can be drawn off the grid. We only have a certain building capacity, certain, land out here where we can store, host the data centers, things like that. And so when people look and they're growing the size of AI processing that's going to occur in the next 5 to 10, 15 years, they're looking at a 45-degree angle of growth, but we're not going to have the capacity, the power, and the building capacity to support that. So, something's got to give. My take on it is that I think the estimation in terms of how many data centers that we need and how much power consumption that we need to support our desires for AI is just a bit out of whack. I think we can focus on the ability to kind of make AI more efficient and use less power. Not every AI system needs to use a GPU, for example, things like that. And the focus is not on that right now. The focus right now is to raising billions and billions of dollars from the AI providers to get money to fund data center builds. And it's just not going to work. So if you look at the scale and the estimations that people are making right now in terms of how data centers need to grow to support the growing AI infrastructure, we're never going to get there. So we have to figure out a plan B, which means, do less AI, don't use it for everything, which is absolutely the case. And do some optimization of the existing infrastructures. Stop, throwing processors and memory and electricity at these things. That's not what it's for. I've been building AI systems since the 80s. And even though they do take a lot of processing and they may, use some higher end computers in many instances, I'm not sure each and every AI system is going to need the type of processing, the infrastructure everybody is estimating that they need. So they're way out ahead of their skis in terms of data centers and the build of data centers, the use of electricity. So next, AGI won't happen anytime soon. And I did a video about this. I'll go ahead and post it here. You can take a look at that. But this is a big marketing message that we're hearing from the AI providers. In other words, stick with us and we'll get you AGI, artificial general intelligence, where it's going to simulate, human intelligence, and it's really going to be able to solve its own problems. It's going to be smarter than any one of us, all those sorts of things. In reality, if you look at what AI is and what it can do, there's limitations to it. While we can build an LLM, it's going to be fairly impressive in terms of its behaviors it's able to return. And certainly everybody was kind of blown away by the rise of generative AI and LLMs in 2022. As we're growing the technology, in order to get to the idea of AGI is just going to be nearly impossible, if not impossible. I don't think I'm going to see it in my lifetime. I don't think, I don't think it's going to be happening anytime soon. I do think you're going to see some companies that will come out and claim that they have AGI, and they'll do some sort of a simulation, where it's an impressive thing, but it's not necessarily AGI. So AGI, in terms of the nirvana that we're going to hit in terms of AI capabilities, it's not going to happen because of the limitation of the technology. And lots of experts agree with me on that. I stated that when people were first talking about it a couple of years ago. And people disagreed with me. Many people, pushed back hard. You don't know what you're talking about. AGI is, a year or two away. No, that's not going to be the case. Based on my understanding what AGI is, and I'm, taking the definition that everybody's using, the AI systems and the growth of the technology won't get us there. In fact, it's going to be far short of anything like it. Remember, the domain of innovation and creativity is the domain of human beings. That's where we're around. In other words, we can use technology as a force multiplier for our innovation and creation, but it's something that we're capable of doing that machine learning, generative AI systems can't do yet, and they won't be able to do for a long period of time. They're really bad at nuances. They're really bad at creating. They're really bad at inventing net new stuff. All they can do is remember what they've been trained with. And the training data really is translated into some sort of a solution. And if the training data is not there, they weren't trained upon it, the pattern's not there, they won't be able to give you a response. They can't make things up from scratch. They can combine topics, they can combine concepts, and come up to some sort of a logical pattern based on those. But as far as what we do as humans and inventing new things that didn't exist before, AI can't do that, won't be able to do that anytime soon. So next, many companies are spending heavily on AI, but many still struggle to demonstrate clear, lasting ROI beyond small pilots and demos. This is the big secret that's out there now. And there is a lot of conflicting information. If you look at the MIT study, which is getting a little old now, but it was 6 months old, where they, talked about 95% of the AI projects out there are unable to produce ROI, which means they're a failed project. That's more in line with what I'm seeing out there. And so there's a lot of AI going on. People are typically using LLMs to, create small applications to prototype various systems for the business. But as far as these game-changing uses of AI, where they're truly able to use an AI system as a true force multiplier for the business. In other words, the ability to create something that's going to be a differentiator, such as a enhanced customer experience that's far beyond any of that of their competitors, or the ability to have marketing and manufacturing efficiencies, your ability to have logistics efficiencies, things like that. We kind of know how those things are going to be built and how much they're going to cost, but most organizations haven't really started that journey yet. They're doing dribs and drabs, small pilots, small systems, things like that. And when I'm brought to look at these solutions, I'm always, unimpressed by them. They're not necessarily solving a problem that is going to blow the doors off of the business. And I think that's because they're, taking very small movements into the AI space that cost a lot, has a lot of risk, and they're basically behaving like businesses behave. You got to remember, like, even in the early days of cloud computing, it was stated everybody's going to be moving to the cloud in a few months or few years, whatever. And the incremental move to the cloud was way slower than people thought. And I think what they said would occur in a year, probably occurred over 10 years. And this is still occurring today. And so that seems to be the pattern of adoption of any technology from the enterprise. They're going to learn about it, understand where the value is, experiment with it. And then they'll have a slow growth and a slow utilization of the new technology, in this case, generative AI, over a longer period of time than people think. And so during that time, they're going to be making mistakes. You're not going to see a lot of ROI that's coming back for the business. So many of these moonshots that we're hearing about out there, where they're going to build, this hugely efficient AI system for banking, for manufacturing, for retail, things like that, is just a lot of bloviating right now. We're not seeing these large systems that are bringing any kind of value back to the business. If they're out there, show me. Because, I go to these demos all the time, work with a lot of the vendors. They're going to show me their solutions or their use cases as best to define how people are using their technology. Stuff out there is not very impressive. And I think what our expectations are for the technology and what we've actually done are hugely and vastly different. So finally, the AI agents will run everywhere. Story is ahead of reality by a long shot, because real work requires consistent, reliable, correct tool use and accountability when things go wrong. So the agent thing is driving me nuts. And the agentic AI, kind of pushing the marketing hype, it has been out there for about 2 years, and it is huge, and it is large, and it is confusing to many of the enterprises out there, because they don't see a lot occurring, based on what's being stated. I did a video on McKinsey, and the CEO of McKinsey said a certain number of our employees are agents, and that kind of stuff. And you see that kind of hyperbole all the time, and where people are looking to replace actual human beings with a little piece of software that's able to make proactive responses and typically leveraging an LLM to do it, which is useful. No, not pushing it back against AI agents and their usability, within a business framework, and certainly personal utilization by people. In other words, your ability to, bring up your email, have an agent, automatically read it, schedule things on your schedule things in your calendar, send automatic emails back out. Those are handy, but those don't replace humans. They're just a productivity aid. And so we're seeing that kind of stuff where people are predicting that we're going to have these incredibly intelligent, proactive, autonomous agents. They're going to replace the humans, and we're going to be hiring and training these agents instead of hiring and training humans. Agentic AI, useful, It does have a very narrow scope of use cases, more so than people think. In other words, there's a reason to use it and there's more reasons not to use it. It's expensive. In other words, it's typically 10 to 20 times that of using traditional, software systems or even traditional AI, machine learning systems. And it is being overinflated in terms of the expectations. At the end of the day, it is a piece of software that is able to take a proactive view. You can set it up with goals and objectives. In other words, pre-program it and tell it what it needs to do and the kinds of objectives it needs to search. And it's able to have a heartbeat, in essence, looking at the data, looking at the environment, looking at the time, whatever. And at certain times, it's able to kick off processes that are typically going to be driven by some sort of an LLM system on the back end. These things do not have, the way they're written now, small language models that are native to the agents. They're leveraging a remote LLM that may be 3,000 miles away. So you look at the architecture and what they're able to do, not that impressive. And you look at the kind of problems that are being solved out there, again, like the AI systems that people have dragged me to see and talk about this superior agentic system that they have built up. It turns out to be a huge disappointment. It's just weak tea. And in many cases, I would ask the question, I could have solved that with a non-AI solution. It'll work just as well. And not all of them, but some of them, that's going to be the case, where AI was just kind of a force fit, or agentic AI was kind of a force fit. So we're at this weird time in the maturation of this technology where people, in terms of how they're practicing and using the technology, is very different than the perception out there. And the perception out there is that we're probably 10 years ahead of where we actually are. And I think that's okay. That's kind of how technology is driven. We're always going to be out ahead of our skis in terms of the hype around using technology, any technology. Again, cloud, web, client server, service-oriented architecture, enterprise application integration, which I invented. All of these things basically come around to adding value, but the expectations are normally far ahead of the value curve. In other words, it's going to take a few years, if not many years, before the value, the business value, is able to catch up to the hyperbole. And right now, as best I can tell, we have about $40 billion of marketing spending out there that's driving the market. And everybody is behaving kind of weirdly now. And for good reason. In other words, if they're able to, pump up their company and pump up their technology around, some sort of a vision in the utilization of AI, they're going to get, higher stock prices, higher market caps, and they're going to cash in. There's a lot of people getting rich right now around the hype. In other words, people are buying stock and investing in companies based on the hype, based on the perception of the hype. It's not necessarily in reality, but the reality is that they're pumping up the price of these companies, and the CEOs and the boards of directors and investors in the company are going to make bank typically on this until the bubble bursts. And then we're going to have a bit of an issue. And normally the people holding the bag when that occurs are the, poor people with 401k accounts and, with investments in stock market for the retirement. It's going to be, it's going to hurt them more. And so we kind of have to keep an eye on that. So anyway, that's kind of my 2 cents on it. Let me know what you think in the comments about this. Let me know if you agree with me, if you disagree with anything I said. Happy to talk about it. But I do think it's important that we do some level setting in terms of what AI is actually doing and versus what we just think it's going to be doing. And I understand it's great to get around in a circle and to hype the technology and get excited about it. I get excited about technology as well. But also, I've been around for long enough where I know it is not necessarily a good idea to misunderstand what the technology can actually do. Certainly if it's driving core business decisions where people are going to be making multi-billion-dollar mistakes. And I do see some of those mistakes occurring in the next few years. Anyway, don't forget to like and subscribe and check out my other videos on this channel. Also check out my InfoWorld Cloud Computing blog, my 100+ LinkedIn learning courses, and of course, my generative AI architecture course out on Go Cloud Careers. And finally, my latest books, Unlocking the Power of Cloud and An Insider's Guide to Cloud Computing. So until next week, stay very, very safe. The magical YouTube algorithm thinks this is another one of my videos that you should watch next. Take care, guys.